she can't even read. Lady Langham's voice crossed the wool room of Dunroyd Park with the polished ease of a silver knife, and every hand above the long inspection table became still. It was Thursday, the 5th of May, 1859, and the spring cloth contracts of House Kingsley lay arranged beneath tall mullioned windows in disciplined rows of folded wool, merchant samples, sealing cords, and numbered account slips. Outside, the hills of the West Riding rose green beyond the stone terraces. Inside, beneath the painted ceiling and the watchful portraits of dead dukes, Margaret Langham stood with one hand resting on a cracked yew-wood thread-winder, and the other holding a contractor's notice she had been ordered to read aloud. The printed lines were narrow and close. They pressed toward one another whenever too many eyes waited for her to fail. Margaret had managed the heading and the first sentence. Then a merchant shifted his chair. Someone's cuff brushed the table. Gertrude Langham sighed as though enduring a tiresome child. The words blurred into a dark fence across the page. Margaret stopped. She could have guessed. She knew enough of the contract language to manufacture a convincing phrase and spare herself the silence gathering around her. Instead, she lowered the paper. "I'm not certain of the final clause," she said. "I won't pretend that I am." Lady Langham's smile widened by the smallest degree. She was dressed in mourning grey, softened with lavender, the careful costume of a baronet's widow, who intended sorrow to improve her authority. "You see, Your Grace," she said, "she can't even read." A few of the county patronesses glanced down. One merchant examined his signet ring. Reginald Poole, Gertrude's son by her first marriage, leaned forward with an expression of fraternal concern so graceful that only Margaret saw the satisfaction beneath it. "Don't distress yourself, Margaret," he said. "I'll read it for you." Margaret did not release the notice. At the head of the table, Philip Kingsley, Duke of Tillingham, had not moved. He was 36, broad-shouldered without heaviness, and dressed in a dark morning coat, whose severe cut made the brass buttons on Reginald's waistcoat seem needlessly bright. Society called him witty when he wished to be charming, and formidable when he did not. At that moment he appeared neither amused nor angry. He was looking not at the notice in Margaret's hand, but at the cloth samples she had rearranged before the meeting began. "Miss Langham," he said, "why did you move the grey twill from lot 6 to lot 4? Gertrude's fingers tightened around her fan. Margaret looked toward the samples. "Because it doesn't belong with lot 6. The labels say otherwise. The labels are wrong." Reginald gave a soft laugh. "The weaver's mark is perfectly clear." Margaret set down the notice. "The weaver's mark is not the pattern." She touched the cracked thread-winder, an object no larger than her palm, made of dark yew with one spoke split near its end. Her mother had used it to wind embroidery silk before illness weakened her hands. Later, she had taught Margaret to count woven repeats by touch when printed figures became too crowded. Margaret placed the thread-winder along the selvage of the grey cloth. "This repeat returns after 12 narrow ribs and 1 broad rib. Lot 6 returns after 10. The cloth belongs with lot 4, whatever the paper says." A merchant at the far end bent to examine it. "She is correct," he said after a moment. Reginald's smile did not disappear, but it ceased to reach his eyes. Philip looked at the contractor's notice, then at the samples, then back to Margaret, and the length. The recorded length may also be wrong. That drew every gaze she had just escaped. Gertrude gave a short, incredulous breath. "Margaret, you've already embarrassed yourself enough." Philip's head turned. "Lady Langham." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The room obeyed the title before it obeyed the man. No one in this room will be embarrassed for refusing to state what she does not know. Silence followed, sharper than applause. Margaret felt the first unsteady movement beneath her ribs. She had been defended before, usually in the soft language reserved for the unfortunate. Poor Margaret. Sensitive Margaret. Margaret who must not be pressed. The Duke had not called her delicate. He had called her honest. Philip reached for the black calfskin ledger resting beside his right hand. It was smaller than the estate day books carried by clerks and more carefully made, with a brass clasp and pages edged in dull red. Margaret had noticed that he kept it close, even when servants cleared the other papers. Reginald had noticed it too. His shoulders altered almost imperceptibly when Philip opened the clasp. "Your Grace," the estate steward began, "those entries contain private wage advances, which is why the ledger will not leave this table." Philip turned it toward Margaret. He did not push it across as one might toss a challenge. He rotated it carefully so the columns faced her. "Miss Langham, can you examine these figures in whatever manner serves you best?" Gertrude stared at him. Reginald's hand settled flat upon the leather case beside his chair. "Your Grace, surely this is unnecessary," he said. Margaret's difficulty is not confined to printed notices. Margaret heard the old method in his voice. Define her before she spoke. Offer mercy before she asked. Turn every hesitation into proof of incapacity. Philip did not look away from her. "That was not my question." Margaret approached the head of the table. The ledger pages were handwritten, but the entries were crowded into narrow columns. She took 2 blank account slips from a stack and laid one above the first line and one below it, leaving only a single entry visible. Philip watched the adjustment without comment. That restraint steadied her more than encouragement would have done. "I'll need the grey twill," she said. A footman moved, but Margaret shook her head and lifted it herself. She placed the folded cloth beside the ledger, then drew the yew thread winder along the woven ribs. 12 narrow, 1 broad. 12 narrow, 1 broad. Her fingers knew the rhythm before her eyes finished tracing it. Philip rested one hand on the table, close enough for her to be aware of his presence, but not so close that it crowded her work. "What are you comparing?" he asked. "The number of repeats against the credited yardage." "And what does that tell you?" "How much cloth must exist between the finished ends?" Reginald leaned back. "Patter repeats vary in the cutting." "Not by an entire yard," Margaret said. She moved the spacing slips to the next line. "Widow Shaw, 18 yards accepted." Payment entered beneath it. Margaret counted the repeats again, slower now. The merchant who had confirmed the first error came closer. No one laughed. No one whispered. Even Gertrude's fan had stopped. Margaret reached the final repeat and felt something cold settle beneath her breastbone. This piece was credited as 18 yards. Philip glanced down. That is what the ledger records. It cannot be 18. Reginald's fingers curved around the edge of his leather case. Cloth shrinks. Not before fulling. Margaret looked at the steward. Was this sample taken before or after finishing? Before, Miss Langham? Then it should be nearly 19 yards. Philip's expression changed at last, not surprise, attention sharpened into purpose. "Nearly. The pattern proves the missing length. I would want the full piece measured before stating the exact loss." "Clerical rounding," Reginald said. The answer came too quickly. Margaret turned toward him. Beside his hand, the leather case had opened slightly. Inside lay a brass yard measure fitted with a decorative rosette near the ferrule, its polished surface catching the pale Yorkshire light. Margaret had seen that flower before, though she could not yet remember where. Philip followed her gaze. "Mr. Poole," he said, "was this cloth purchased under your supervision?" Reginald closed the case, along with dozens of other pieces. "A minor variation proves nothing. One variation proves little," Margaret said. "A repeated variation would prove more." Gertrude rose. "This has become absurd. Margaret cannot read a simple notice. Yet now she presumes to instruct men who have conducted trade all their lives." Margaret's throat tightened, but she kept her hand upon the thread winder, its cracked spoke pressed against her palm, familiar and real. Philip closed the contractor's notice and set it aside. "The notice may wait," he said. "The discrepancy will not." He looked at Margaret again. "How many entries must you examine before you can tell whether it repeats?" "At least 6, preferably every piece purchased through the same measure." Reginald's face remained composed. Only his thumb moved, pressing once against the leather above the hidden brass tool. Philip drew the private ledger closer to Margaret, but kept his hand on its lower corner, preserving both trust and custody. "Then begin with 6. Margaret lowered the first spacing card. The room had not become kinder. Gertrude had not become less dangerous. Yet the axis of the table had shifted. The Duke had not asked her to read as society required. He had asked her to see what others had missed. Margaret looked once more at the closed leather case and the brass glint beneath its edge. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I believe the missing length may not be in the book at all." By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the wool room had been cleared of merchants, patronesses, and all but the estate steward. Yet Margaret could still feel the weight of their silence clinging to her sleeves. The black calfskin ledger remained in the Duke's possession. He carried it himself to the morning room, where tall windows admitted a softer light, and an open doorway led into the adjoining salon. His widowed aunt sat beyond that doorway with her embroidery frame and a silver tea service, near enough to satisfy propriety without pretending not to understand why privacy mattered. Philip placed the ledger on the central table and kept one hand on its cover until Margaret had taken the chair opposite him. "You may arrange the room as you require," he said. Margaret looked at the page, then at the stacks of correspondence and folded samples surrounding it. "I require less of it." His mouth shifted, almost into a smile. "That may be the most sensible request made in this house all week." He moved the letters aside. The steward removed 2 account books, leaving only the private ledger, the grey twill, Margaret's yew-wood thread winder, and a neat pile of blank slips. Margaret selected 2 of the slips and placed them above and below the first visible line. It helped, but the handwritten columns were still too narrow. "May I cut these?" she asked. Philip glanced at the slips. "They belong to me. You may destroy them without remorse." He rang for a small pair of paper scissors when the footman delivered them. Philip did not pass the task to Margaret, as though it were a test of steadiness. He measured the width she indicated against the ledger lines and cut 6 narrow cards himself. His fingers were precise. He asked no unnecessary question until he had finished. "Will those serve?" "Yes." Margaret placed 1 card along each side of the first entry, reducing the page to a single strip of ink. The relief was immediate. The words did not alter, but they stopped competing with one another. She could breathe between them. Philip watched her expression rather than the page. "Better?" "Much." "Then we shall use them." The simple declaration unsettled her more deeply than kindness would have done. Gertrude had always treated every adjustment as evidence of defect. She would sigh when Margaret requested larger handwriting, laugh when she covered one line to see another, and declare that the world would not rearrange itself for a woman who could not keep pace with it. Philip had rearranged the table in less than a minute. He did not look as though he believed he had performed charity. Margaret turned to the ledger. She checked the first 6 entries connected to the spring cloth purchases, comparing credited yardage with the pattern repeats in each retained sample. The estate steward brought the matching pieces from the wool room one at a time. Philip remained beside the ledger whenever it was open. He did not leave it in Margaret's hands, nor did he hover over her shoulder. He sat near enough to answer questions and far enough to let her think. The first discrepancy belonged to Widow Shaw. The second belonged to a woman recorded only as Loom House 12. The third was smaller, though it followed the same direction. Every piece had been credited below the length indicated by its repeating weave. All 3 were purchased through Mr. Poole, Margaret said. The steward turned several pages in his daybook. So were the remaining entries selected by Miss Langham. Philip looked at him. Were any pieces from another factor measured on the same day? Yes, Your Grace. 2 from Mr. Cartwright of Bradford. And were those lengths disputed? No. Margaret examined the Cartwright entries. Their figures matched the cloth. She then moved to the 4th sample under Reginald's supervision. The error appeared again. It was not identical in yards, but the proportion was close. The longer the piece, the greater the loss. Philip leaned back, his expression stripped of the faint amusement that society mistook for ease. You said the missing length might not be in the book. The book may record what someone told it to record. Margaret moved one spacing card down to the next line. If each piece was measured with the same instrument, the error could occur before the entry was written. A damaged measure, the steward asked. Perhaps. Margaret studied the sequence, but ordinary damage would not produce such regularity. Philip folded his hands. What would? A rule that is not the length it claims. No one spoke for several breaths. From the adjoining salon came the quiet click of Philip's aunt setting down her teacup. A yard is 36 inches, the steward said at last. It should be. Margaret touched the edge of the twill. If the rule used in purchase was slightly longer, the worker would surrender more cloth for each counted yard. She would be paid for fewer yards than she delivered. Philip's gaze sharpened. How much longer? I cannot say yet. She looked at the figures again. Something near an inch, perhaps less. The error accumulates. And whoever purchases the cloth retains the difference, either in cloth or in the money credited for it. The steward's face hardened. Philip did not immediately accuse Reginald. Margaret noticed that. A duke could have summoned a servant, ordered a search, and turned suspicion into guilt by the force of his displeasure. Philip instead closed the ledger. We will compare the instrument before drawing any conclusion. The next morning, Reginald arrived in the morning room, carrying the leather case Margaret had seen beside him in the wool room. Gertrude accompanied him, dressed in deep violet silk, her mourning subdued whenever business required attention. Philip's aunt remained in the adjoining salon. The steward stood near the windows. Margaret had already arranged the blank cards beside the closed ledger, though Philip had not yet opened it. Reginald laid the case on the table. I understand my trade measure has become an object of fascination, he said. I should hate to disappoint anyone. No one is here to be entertained. Philip replied. Reginald released the brass clasp. Inside lay the yard measure, polished and elegant, with a decorative rosette near the metal ferrule. He withdrew it and placed it beside a plain wooden measuring stick from the estate stores. The ends aligned. The steward checked the marks. 36 inches, he said. Reginald spread one hand, exactly as any yard should be. Gertrude gave Margaret a look of weary triumph. I hope this will end the matter. Nervousness can make a person imagine patterns where none exist. Margaret did not answer her. She watched Reginald's fingers. He had lifted the brass rule by its center, avoiding the rosette entirely. May I examine it? She asked. Reginald hesitated for so little time that another observer might have missed it. Then he smiled. Of course. He passed the measure across the table. Margaret received it with both hands. It was heavier than the estate stick. The brass ferrule shone without scratches, but the rosette seemed slightly raised from the shaft. She ran one fingertip over its edge. Something moved beneath the metal, not enough to shift the length. Only a minute yielding, like a latch held under tension. Reginald reached forward at once. Careful. It's an expensive instrument. His hand closed around the measure before she had agreed to return it. Philip's voice cooled. Mr. Poole. Reginald released his grip, though not the measure. I meant only to prevent damage, Your Grace. Margaret looked at the rosette. It moved. Gertrude exhaled sharply. Margaret, must every object now conspire against you? I did not say it conspired. Margaret kept her voice even. I said it moved. Philip turned to Reginald. The measure will remain unchanged until the scheduled contract inspection. It is my property. It is the instrument used under a House Kingsley contract. Philip's tone remained courteous. You will bring it when required, in its present condition. Reginald's smile thinned. Naturally, he returned the rule to the leather case and closed the clasp. Philip waited until Reginald and Gertrude had left before reopening the ledger. Margaret resumed the examination with the spacing cards. The fifth entry followed the pattern. So did the sixth. She compared the credited lengths, then wrote a short calculation on one blank slip. Philip watched her form the figures slowly, leaving room between them. What do you have? The losses are not equal, she said. They are proportional. She placed the slip beside Widow Shaw's entry. The longer the cloth, the more she loses. That is what would happen if every counted yard contained nearly one unacknowledged inch. The steward bent over the figures. Across 18 yards, enough to take almost another half yard from her payment, Margaret said. She moved to a second entry and calculated again. The result aligned. Widow Shaw had not suffered an isolated mistake. Neither had Loom House 12. Someone had built the missing length into the act of measurement itself. Philip looked toward the closed door through which Reginald had departed, then back to the narrow cards he had cut for Margaret. You said you did not yet know. I still do not know how the instrument changes. Margaret touched the calculation, careful not to overstate what the evidence could bear. But I know the book is recording a loss of almost 1 extra inch for every yard measured. The first cottage stood beyond the lower mill road, where the stone walls of Dunroyd Park gave way to narrow fields, damp lanes, and rows of low houses built close against the wind. On the morning of the 6th of May, Margaret travelled there in the Duke's carriage with Philip's widowed aunt beside her, while the estate steward rode opposite and Philip followed on horseback. The black calfskin ledger remained locked in his study at Dunroyd. Only copied figures, prepared under his supervision, had been brought for comparison. Margaret carried those figures in a plain folder, along with her cracked yew-wood threadwinder and 6 narrow spacing cards. The first weaver, Mrs. Alice Shaw, opened her door with flour on one sleeve and suspicion in her eyes. A half-finished length of grey wool stretched across the room between the loom and a wooden frame. The cottage smelled of boiled oats, lamp oil, and lanolin. 2 small chairs had been moved aside to make room for the visitors, though Philip did not enter. He stopped at the threshold. "Mrs. Shaw," he said, "Miss Langham has questions about the measurements recorded for your spring cloth. You may answer as much or as little as you choose." Alice looked from the Duke to Margaret. "Will Mr. Poole be told what I say?" "Not by name," Margaret replied. The woman's gaze sharpened. "Then why is His Grace here?" Philip answered before Margaret could, "to ensure no one mistakes your honesty for disobedience." Alice studied him a moment longer. Then she stepped back and allowed Margaret, the aunt, and the steward inside. Philip remained beyond the doorway, where his rank could be felt but not used to crowd the room. Margaret noticed the choice. She suspected he had made it deliberately. "I won't ask whether you read your account slips," Margaret said once they were seated. Alice's mouth tightened. "I know enough to see what I'm paid. That is not what I mean. I need to know how the cloth was measured." The woman glanced toward the loom. With Mr. Poole's brass rule, did he stretch the cloth himself? His clerk held one end. Mr. Poole counted. Did he touch anything on the rule besides the shaft? Alice hesitated. Her fingers curled into the fold of her apron. "There was a flower," Margaret leaned forward. "A brass flower, near the metal end. He kept his thumb on it." The steward made a note, but Margaret raised one hand. "Use the loom house number, please, not her name." He paused, then crossed out what he had written, and replaced it with loom house 7. Alice's shoulders lowered by a fraction. Margaret removed the retained sample from her folder. It had been cut from the cloth delivered to Dunroyd and labelled by the estate storekeeper. She placed the yew-wood threadwinder against the edge. "May I compare the pattern with the cloth still on your loom?" Alice nodded. Margaret counted silently. 12 narrow ribs, 1 broad rib. 12 narrow ribs, 1 broad rib. The rhythm continued through both pieces without interruption. "This sample came from your delivery," Margaret said. "You were credited for 18 yards. Alice gave a bitter little laugh. "I wove 19. "How do you know?" "Because I counted every repeat before it left." She touched the loom beam. "My husband taught me before he died. One does not lose a yard of wool by accident." Philip's voice came from the doorway, calm and low. "Did you object at the time?" Alice looked toward him. "I did, Your Grace." "And what followed?" "Mr. Poole said women who argued over his measure might find their cottage accounts examined more closely." The room went still. The estate steward looked down at his notes. Margaret kept her voice gentle. "Did he threaten eviction directly?" "Not in those words." "Then we will not put those words in your mouth." Alice looked at her again, this time without suspicion. "He said winter coal was a privilege, not a right." Margaret felt anger rise, cold and exact. She did not let it sharpen her questions. Who else heard him? Mrs. Bell from the next row. The second cottage lay farther up the hill. Mrs. Bell was younger than Alice and kept a sleeping infant in a basket near the hearth, though Margaret did not ask about the child beyond lowering her voice. Philip again remained outside. Mrs. Bell confirmed the brass rosette. "The rule seemed to grow beneath his hand," she said. "Not much, just enough that I thought I had seen it wrong." "Where was his thumb?" Margaret asked. The woman demonstrated against the edge of her own sewing box, pressing near the corner and shifting her hand inward. Here, he held the flower, then turned the metal cap. The steward wrote Loom House 11. Margaret showed her the copied entry. You were credited for 14 yards. 15 were woven. The third cottage gave them no direct accusation, only fear. The woman there would not allow her name to be spoken, and refused to look at Philip. Margaret did not press. She asked only whether the measure had a brass flower and whether Reginald's thumb rested upon it. The answer to both was yes. When they returned to the carriage, the estate steward closed his notebook. 3 accounts are not the whole system. No, Margaret said, but they are enough to justify protection while we learn more. Philip mounted only after his aunt and Margaret were seated. Before the carriage moved, he leaned toward the open door. No cottage rent will be altered. No weaving contract will be withdrawn. No coal allowance will be touched while this inquiry continues. The steward looked uncertain. Your Grace, an oral direction, may be disputed by the factors. Then it will not remain oral. By noon, the order had been written, signed, copied into the estate day book, and sent to every factor connected to the spring. Contracts. It froze evictions, rent increases, dismissal from wage work, and changes to coal allowances for any household offering evidence. Margaret read the short notice in the estate office with one spacing card beneath each line. Philip did not watch her face. He watched the steward seal the copies. That restraint mattered. Later, in the small parlor adjoining the wool room, Margaret laid the retained samples across a table. Philip stood opposite her while his aunt poured tea nearby. The black ledger remained unopened in the locked study. Margaret had only the copied entries and the cloth itself. She placed the threadwinder against Alice Shaw's sample and counted the repeats again. My mother taught me this, she said. Philip's gaze moved to the crack in the U. She wove? No, she embroidered. But she understood pattern better than anyone I knew. Margaret turned the little tool in her hand. When printed lines became crowded, she told me cloth was kinder. It waited. It repeated itself. It gave the eye another chance. And the ledger does not. The ledger can, if one gives it room. Philip looked toward the spacing cards he had cut the day before. Then perhaps ledgers have been designed badly. A brief warmth touched her despite herself. That is a dangerous opinion for a duke. I have survived worse. The steward entered with a folded memorandum. Your Grace, the senior store clerk remembers a brass worker at Sowerby Bridge repairing one of Mr. Poole's measures last winter. Margaret set down the thread winder. Did he say what was repaired? A hollow ferrule, miss. He remembers because the request was unusual. Philip's expression hardened, but he did not reach for the bell or summon Reginald. He looked first at Margaret. Do you consider that enough to confront him? No, she said. It is enough to ask the brass worker what he made. Philip inclined his head. Then we go tomorrow. Margaret looked once more at Alice Shaw's sample, at the repeating ribs that had outlasted threats, account slips, and polite denials. Her mother had been right. Cloth could not speak, but it did not lie. Susa, the road to Sowerby Bridge, descended through folds of green hillside, where stone cottages clung to the slopes, and mill smoke lay in pale bands above the valley. On the morning of the 9th of May, Margaret sat beside Philip's widowed aunt in the Duke's carriage, with the estate steward opposite, and Philip riding close enough to speak through the lowered window when the road narrowed. The black calfskin ledger had remained locked in his study at Dunroyd. They carried only copied figures. the retained cloth sample from Widow Shaw, and the written recollection of the senior store clerk, who had named the brass worker. Margaret kept her cracked yew-wood threadwinder inside her reticule. She had learned not to bring an object of comfort into another person's view unless she was prepared to defend why it mattered. The workshop stood behind a narrow frontage of darkened brick, its windows clouded by years of smoke and metal dust. Inside, shelves held hinges, lamp fittings, buckles, scale weights, and tools whose purpose Margaret could not guess. Mr. Elias Mercer, the brass worker, was a compact man with white whiskers and hands marked by heat. He bowed to Philip with visible alarm, then looked relieved when the Duke asked about a measuring rule rather than unpaid taxes or criminal accusations. "I remember it," Mercer said. "A fine brass-mounted yard, better made than most. Mr. Poole brought it just before Christmas." Philip stood near the workbench, his gloves held loosely in one hand. What required repair? The ferrule. Hollow construction. Unusual request. The steward opened his notebook. Margaret watched Mercer's face. He did not appear evasive. He appeared embarrassed by having remembered too much. "What made it unusual?" she asked. Mercer glanced at Philip before answering her. Mr. Poole didn't want it repaired to one fixed length. He wanted 2 positions. The workshop seemed to contract around the sentence. Philip's expression did not alter, but the stillness in him became dangerous. "Explain," he said. Mercer reached beneath the bench and brought out a wooden demonstration piece, no longer than his forearm. One end was fitted with a plain brass sleeve. The original ferrule was split. "Mr. Poole asked whether I could replace it with a sliding sleeve. It could lock here." He pressed the metal inward until it clicked. "And here." He turned a narrow collar, drew the sleeve outward, and locked it again. The difference looked small. Margaret stepped closer. "How much?" 1 inch and a quarter. The steward stopped writing. Philip picked up a standard wooden rule from the bench and placed it beside the model. With the sleeve retracted, the model measured 36 inches. Extended, it measured 37 1/4. Margaret felt the numbers settle into the pattern she had seen in the copied entries. Not proof of Reginald's actual use. Not yet, but no longer imagination. "Did Mr. Poole tell you why he needed 2 positions?" she asked. "Said he wanted the rule to fit more neatly in its case." Mercer's mouth tightened. That explanation did not make much sense. But gentlemen do not pay craftsmen for opinions. Philip looked at the brass sleeve. Could the extension be controlled by a decorative rosette? Mercer nodded. "Yes, Your Grace. I fitted a flower-shaped catch above the collar. Thumb pressure released the lock." Margaret remembered Reginald's hand closing around the leather case. She remembered the slight yielding beneath the rosette and the speed with which he had taken the measure from her. Could it be made to appear fixed during an ordinary comparison? Easily. Retract the sleeve, turn the collar, and the catch will not release unless pressure comes at the right angle. Philip's jaw hardened. "Then Mr. Poole brought a false measure into my house and placed it on my table." "We do not know that," Margaret said. His gaze came to her. The brass worker lowered his eyes, suddenly intent upon a tray of screws. "We know he commissioned such a mechanism," she continued. "We know the errors in the cloth accounts resemble what that mechanism could produce. We do not know that the measure he displayed was the same instrument Mr. Mercer repaired, nor do we know how he used it. He withdrew it the moment you touched the rosette. That is suspicious. It is more than suspicious, not to anyone who wishes to call your anger persecution." Philip said nothing. His aunt remained seated near the workshop door, hands folded over the head of her walking stick. She watched Margaret with an attention that felt less like supervision than judgment of a different kind. Philip turned back to Mercer. "Did you mark the work?" "I did." Mercer lifted the demonstration model and pointed beneath the brass sleeve. 3 leaves. My repair punch, small enough that it would not show unless the ferrule were extended. "Would you recognize it?" "Yes, Your Grace." Philip reached for the bell pull near the workshop door, then stopped. "I can have the measure taken from Poole before evening." "And if he gives you another?" Margaret asked. "He has already shown us one that measures correctly. If you seize it now, he may say you altered it, exchanged it, or damaged it. He may claim the women complained because you encouraged them." Philip's hand fell from the bell pull. "You would leave the instrument with him?" "Only long enough to require him to produce it under controlled inspection. That gives him time. It also gives him confidence." A trace of his usual wit returned, though no amusement warmed it. "You are asking me to permit a suspected fraudster to believe him clever. I am asking you not to make his defense for him." Mercer looked away quickly, perhaps to conceal approval. Philip studied Margaret for a long moment. "What would you do?" "Issue notice that all spring contract measures will be compared publicly against an official standard. Require him to bring the instrument he used for purchases. Record its condition before witnesses. Do not accuse him yet. And if he changes it, then his behavior becomes evidence of another kind." Philip looked down at the wooden model. "Very well." He asked Mercer to prepare a written account of the repair, but not to send it until requested by the estate solicitor. Mercer agreed. As Margaret turned from the bench, her reticule caught against the corner. The yew-wood thread winder slipped free and fell. Philip caught it before it struck the stone floor. For one breath, the small dark object rested in his palm. His thumb hovered near the cracked spoke without touching it. "May I?" he asked. The question was quiet enough that Mercer and the steward did not hear. Margaret looked at his open hand. "Yes." He examined the worn edges, then placed it back into her palm rather than dropping it into the reticule himself. "Your mother's?" "Yes." She chose durable wood. She believed damaged things should remain useful. Philip's gaze held hers. "So do I." The words might have sounded like pity from another man. From him, after he had accepted her restraint over his own authority, they did not. They returned to Dunroyd before dusk on the 10th of May. The estate steward met them in the entrance hall with a sealed note and anger poorly concealed beneath formality. Lady Langham had visited 2 weaving cottages that afternoon. She had not issued a direct threat. She had merely reminded the women that winter coal was granted by favor, and that favor depended upon gratitude. Widow Shaw's name had been marked for review. Philip read the note once. "Who controls the coal list? Mr. Poole recommends. Lady Langham advises the household charities. Final approval has commonly passed through your agent's office." Not anymore. He crossed into the estate office with Margaret, his aunt, and the steward following. There he dictated a written order establishing an emergency coal account under the steward's sole supervision. Every household that had spoken or might speak during the inquiry would receive its usual winter allowance, regardless of any recommendation, from Reginald or Gertrude. No cottage could be removed without Philip's signed review. The steward wrote quickly. Philip read the finished order, signed it, and sealed 2 copies. Send one to every factor and one to Lady Langham. Margaret watched the wax harden beneath the Kingsley seal. He had not answered coercion with a speech. He had removed the weapon. Philip turned to her. "You were right about the measure. You were also right about what must happen before I touch it. We are not yet certain about the actual instrument." "No," his eyes sharpened, "but we are certain about the kind of man who frightens widows with winter." Before Margaret could reply, a footman entered carrying a card from Reginald. The message was brief. Mr. Poole welcomed the Duke's inspection and proposed that Miss Langham herself demonstrate her theory before the spring contractors. Philip handed her the card. Margaret covered the lower lines with one finger and read the final sentence twice. Reginald had not merely accepted the challenge. He had chosen the audience. At the bottom, in a confident hand, he had written, "Let Miss Langham measure before everyone." By the morning of the 11th of May, Reginald's challenge had become an invitation list. Margaret discovered this not from Philip, but from the estate steward who entered the small breakfast room, carrying a sheaf of cream cards marked with the Kingsley crest. Philip's widowed aunt sat at the head of the table, calmly buttering toast. Gertrude occupied the chair nearest the fire, her expression composed beneath a lavender cap. Reginald stood at the window as though he had no interest in the matter. Philip was reading a draft notice beside the silver coffee service. "The long gallery will accommodate 40 guests without crowding the inspection table," the steward said. "Mr. Cartwright has accepted. 2 Bradford factors will attend, along with the borough officer bringing the official yard standard. Lady Marston and Mrs. Crowther have also requested places." Margaret looked at the invitations. Places for what? Philip raised his eyes. The pause before he answered was brief, but it was enough. "A public remeasurement of the disputed cloth contracts." "And what part have you assigned to me?" Gertrude lowered her cup with delicate care. Reginald remained turned toward the window. Philip folded the draft notice. "You will demonstrate the pattern calculation and explain the discrepancy." Margaret felt the room become very clear. The edge of the white tablecloth, the steam rising from the coffee, the narrow shadow cast by Philip's hand across the paper. "You have already announced this. The invitations have not yet gone. But the decision has been made." His expression sharpened. "The decision to inspect the contracts has been made. You discovered the discrepancy. It is reasonable that you should present the method." "Reasonable to whom?" Gertrude gave a soft sigh. "Must everything become a grievance?" Philip did not look at her. "Lady Langham, I would prefer to hear Miss Langham's answer without assistance." Margaret placed both hands in her lap so no one would see the slight tremor in her fingers. "You trusted me with a private ledger," she said. "Now you have turned that trust into a public duty without asking whether I consented. The workers require public protection. They require accurate contracts. That does not make my presence yours to promise." Reginald turned then, his face arranged in courteous concern. "Surely you do not intend to withdraw after making such serious implications?" Margaret met his gaze. "I intend to decide for myself whether I stand before your audience." His smile thinned. Philip pushed back his chair. "This conversation will continue elsewhere." He asked his aunt to accompany them to the long gallery after breakfast. Gertrude started to rise, but Philip stopped her with one glance. "Not you." The long gallery ran along the southern side of Dunroyd, its high windows overlooking moorland, broken by stone walls and pale spring fields. Servants had already begun clearing tables from the central space. At one end, the steward had placed a long trestle beneath the portraits of Philip's ancestors. The empty arrangement made the gathering feel inevitable. Philip's aunt settled near the windows with her embroidery. Margaret stood beside the trestle. Philip remained opposite her. "I should have spoken to you first," he said. Yes, the immediate agreement seemed to surprise him. I believed speed mattered. It does. The spring contracts are renewed within days. If Reginald's measure is false, delay gives him time to continue. And if the measure appears honest, Philip's mouth tightened, then we continue investigating. No, society will decide that the investigation ended here. Margaret touched the smooth edge of the empty table. Reginald proposed this because he wants me at the center of the failure. You have given him exactly that. I have also given you my authority. Your authority is the problem. His brows drew together. You think my support weakens your claim? I think it changes the claim. The question should be whether the measure is false. Once you announce that I speak under your protection, the question becomes why a duke favors a woman his guests already consider incapable. Let them question me. They will not stop with you. He walked a few paces toward the windows, then returned. The movement revealed more agitation than anger would have done. You would prefer that I remain silent while they mock you? I would prefer that you trust evidence enough not to replace it with rank. Philip looked toward his aunt, but she did not lift her head from the embroidery frame. A duke's endorsement can prevent cruelty, he said. It can also make truth look purchased. The words struck him. Margaret saw it in the stillness that followed, yet he did not yield at once. There are practical consequences beyond your reputation and mine. House Kingsley has already been accused of ignoring contractor abuses. By whom? County newspapers, 2 members of Parliament, a committee in Leeds that believes hereditary landowners should not hold industrial interests they do not understand. Margaret had not known that. The information explained the speed, the official yard standard, and the force beneath Philip's restraint. Were the accusations just? She asked. His jaw shifted. Some were. Under your management? Under my father's. He turned toward the portraits lining the gallery. He believed respectable agents did not require inspection. Complaints from workers were passed through the very men accused of abusing them. By the time the estate intervened, families had lost wages for years. And you fear becoming him. Philip faced her again. I refuse to become him. Those are not the same thing. His gaze held hers. Margaret continued before courage deserted her. You want this demonstration to protect the women. You also want it to prove that you are not your father. Is that dishonorable? No, but it becomes dangerous when you use another person as the proof. His expression changed, not into offense, but into something more exposed. You believe I am using you. I believe you trusted what I saw. Then, without asking, you decided what that trust required me to do before 40 witnesses. His aunt's needle paused above the fabric, though she still did not speak. Philip rested both hands on the trestle. If I withdraw the invitations now, Reginald will claim I feared the test. He will. The contracts may be renewed. They may. Then what would you have me do? Margaret looked along the empty gallery. In 6 days, it would be filled with merchants, officials, county ladies, and women whose winter coal had nearly been used to buy their silence. Refusing would protect her from a spectacle. It might also leave Reginald free to keep the measure and call every discrepancy a nervous woman's fancy. Send the invitations, she said. Philip's relief came too quickly. But not because you have chosen for me. He stilled. I will attend because the workers cannot wait for society to become fair before they are paid fairly. I will show the pattern. I will state only what we can prove. I will not read a prepared address. Agreed. And you will not tell the guests that I act under your authority. Philip hesitated. They must understand that you have my confidence. Then let them understand it from your conduct, not from a declaration that makes me sound like your instrument. He lowered his eyes for a moment, then nodded. Agreed. Margaret should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt the distance between them more acutely than before, because she had begun to care whether he truly understood. Philip reached toward the invitations, then stopped. You said I had made your presence mine to promise. You had. I am sorry. The apology was quiet, without ornament. She accepted its sincerity, but did not confuse sincerity with correction. Do not apologize only because I objected, she said. Change what you do next. A faint, rueful smile touched his mouth. You are severe, Miss Langham. You invited accuracy into your house, Your Grace. So's I did. By the 13th of May, the long gallery had been measured, the official standard requested, and every retained cloth sample logged under the steward's supervision. Philip ordered 2 footmen to watch the wool store in shifts, with no sample removed unless its number and destination were entered. Margaret prepared no speech. She arranged her spacing cards, copied only the necessary ledger entries, and counted the grey twill until the pattern lived in her fingertips. Across the estate, Reginald worked in the dye house with the leather case open before him. He withdrew the brass yard measure and pressed the flower-shaped catch. The ferrule slid outward with a soft metallic whisper. For a moment, the rule stretched to 37 1/4 inches. Then he pushed the sleeve back, turned the locking collar, and tested the rosette. It no longer released beneath ordinary pressure. He placed the perfectly honest yard into its case and closed the clasp. On the morning of the 14th of May, the long gallery no longer resembled a place of judgment. The invitation tables had been removed, the portraits watched from a respectful distance, and only one length of grey cloth lay across the central trestle. Philip's widowed aunt sat near the southern windows, with an embroidery basket at her feet. The estate steward stood beside a smaller table, holding the copied entries from the black calfskin ledger, which remained locked in Philip's study. Margaret had brought her spacing cards and cracked yew-wood threadwinder. Nothing else. She had refused the written address prepared by the steward, though it contained no insult, and several phrases Philip considered reassuring. It begins by telling them what I'm about to prove, she said. If the measure does not reveal what we expect, those words will become evidence against me. Philip folded the paper and placed it aside. Then we use no address. Margaret positioned one spacing card beneath the first copied entry. The other cards lay in a neat row, cut to the width Philip had made for her. She had not forgotten that small act. She had also not mistaken it for a promise that he would always understand what she needed. Begin as you intend to begin on Tuesday, he said. Margaret looked toward the empty chairs arranged for imaginary merchants. Even without occupants, they created pressure. She could see Gertrude among them, smiling before Margaret had spoken. She could see Reginald's thumb resting upon the brass flower. Her throat tightened. I won't begin with the ledger, she said. Why not? The steward asked. Because the figures mean nothing until the cloth is visible. She placed the yew thread winder against the grey twill. I will show the repeat first. 12 narrow ribs, 1 broad rib. Then I will ask the steward to confirm how the retained sample was recorded. You will not read the entry yourself? Philip asked. There was no challenge in the question, but Margaret felt the old instinct to defend herself. She released it slowly. I may not. She moved the lower spacing card until only Widow Shaw's line remained visible. Den's printed lines are the worst. Handwriting is easier when it is not cramped. Figures are often clearer because they remain separate. But when a room waits for me to fail, the lines move toward one another. Philip's aunt lowered her embroidery. The steward looked away with the discomfort of a decent man hearing something private. Philip did not. "Do the words blur?" he asked. "Not exactly. I can see them. I simply cannot always hold their order." Margaret kept her eyes on the copied entry. A line above intrudes upon the one I am reading. Then the line below does the same. If I hurry, I exchange one word for another. If I stop, people assume I cannot continue. And the cards prevent that. They give each line room. Philip glanced at the discarded address. I should have asked before arranging any demonstration. "You said that already. I did not understand the whole of what I was asking you to endure." Margaret's fingers rested upon the thread winder, its cracked spoke pressed against her palm. My stepmother understood. The words came out more quietly than she intended. Philip's expression changed. What did she do? Margaret looked toward his aunt. The older woman remained still, her presence steady rather than intrusive. Margaret turned back to the cloth. After my father married her, she began inviting guests to hear me read dinner notices. At first, she said it would improve me. Later, she stopped pretending. The gallery seemed to narrow around her voice. She chose notices with small print. She stood behind my chair. If I paused, she supplied the wrong word loudly enough for everyone to hear. When I corrected her, she laughed and said even a child should know better. When I did not correct her, she told people I had no understanding of what I read. Philip's hand closed once at his side. "How old were you?" 14 when it began. And Sir Walter allowed it. My father was often away. When he was home, she called the gatherings lessons. He believed instruction was kindness because he had never seen the performance. Margaret adjusted the cloth, though it did not need adjusting. By the time he understood, I had learned to avoid reading before anyone. Then he died before he could change much beyond my private allowance. Sir Walter had been dead 18 months. The fact remained clean and final. No memory could bring him into the room to repair what he had failed to prevent. Philip looked at the copied ledger entry. Tuesday may repeat the same cruelty. It may. Then we cancel. The answer came so quickly that Margaret looked up. You would stop the inspection. I will not place you before 40 witnesses, merely because I was too proud to recognize what the room means to you. The contracts will be renewed. I can suspend them. For how long? Philip did not answer at once. The steward did. A fortnight, perhaps 3 weeks. After that, the merchants may petition the estate or take their orders elsewhere. And the women? Margaret asked. They may lose spring work while the dispute remains unresolved. Philip's jaw tightened. I will cover their wages. From your private purse. If necessary. Then Reginald will say the complaints were purchased by your favor. Gertrude will say the women lied because you paid them. Every truth will become another proof of your partiality. Philip walked to the nearest window. Beyond the glass, the hills were bright beneath a thin wash of sunlight. You are asking me to let this proceed, despite what it costs you? No. Margaret placed the copied entry flat on the table. I am choosing to let it proceed because the workers cannot wait for society to become considerate. He turned. Then tell me the conditions. No prepared speech. Agreed. No one reads for me, unless I ask. Agreed, if I pause, no one completes my sentence. Agreed, the cloth and the official standard must remain visible. Rank must not be offered as proof. Philip held her gaze. You mean I am not to declare my confidence in you? You may show confidence by allowing the evidence to stand. And if Gertrude attacks you, you may stop an insult. You may not replace my answer. His expression tightened at the distinction. Margaret waited. This was the true rehearsal, not the counting of woven ribs. Philip had been generous when generosity cost him nothing. Tuesday would reveal whether his respect survived fear. Agreed, he said at last. You will control the manner of your testimony. If you wish to stop, we stop. Even if the measure has not been examined, even then. The answer eased something inside her, though not enough to remove caution. Philip returned to the table. Shall we try again? Margaret nodded. She began with the cloth. 12 narrow ribs, 1 broad rib. She showed the repeated pattern, then uncovered the single ledger line with her spacing cards. Her voice caught on the word accepted. She stopped. No one supplied it. No one shifted impatiently. Philip waited. Margaret breathed once and continued. When she finished, the steward confirmed the figures. The demonstration took less than 4 minutes. It proved nothing about the hidden ferrule, but it proved that Margaret could shape the room rather than merely survive it. Philip's aunt resumed her embroidery. The steward went to retrieve the sealed list of retained samples. For a moment, Margaret and Philip stood alone at the table, though the open gallery and the presence of his aunt preserved every propriety. Was that bearable? He asked. It was different. Better? Yes. He looked at her hand resting beside the thread window. Then he offered his own, palm upward. He did not reach across the table. He did not assume. Margaret stared at the space between them. Taking his hand would not erase Tuesday. It would not absolve him of the decision he had made without her. Yet his stillness offered no demand. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed gently, warm and steady around hers. He did not pull her nearer. He simply held on. The quiet lasted long enough to become a choice rather than an accident. I am afraid I will forget every promise when the room turns against you, he said. Margaret felt the honesty of it more deeply than confidence. Then remember only one. Which one? Power must listen before it speaks. His thumb moved once against the side of her hand. I will remember. At the far end of Dunroyd, inside the dye house, Reginald closed the leather case around the brass measure and spoke to Gertrude in a low voice. Tomorrow, the measure will be perfectly honest. On Tuesday, the 17th of May, the long gallery of Dunroyd Park filled before 11 o'clock with merchants, county ladies, estate officers, 2 local magistrates, and 6 weaving women who had been invited only after Margaret insisted that those whose wages were at issue should not be hidden behind gentlemen's conclusions. The grey twill lay across the central trestle. Beside it rested the borough's official yard standard, brought that morning under the care of a municipal officer from Halifax. Philip's black calfskin ledger remained beneath his hand at the head of the table. Margaret stood to his right with her spacing cards, copied figures, and cracked yew-wood thread winder arranged before her. She had chosen each object. She had chosen where she would stand. Still, as the doors closed and the last whisper settled beneath the painted ceiling, her throat tightened as though Gertrude's hand had reached across the years and placed itself at the back of her chair. Lady Langham sat among the patronesses in violet silk, composed and attentive. Reginald stood opposite Margaret, with the leather case closed before him. His expression carried the confidence of a man willing to submit to any test because he had chosen its conditions. Philip looked at Margaret. He did not touch the ledger clasp. "Begin when you are ready," he said. She placed the thread winder against the cloth. Her fingers knew the pattern. 12 narrow ribs, 1 broad rib. She repeated the count aloud, slowly enough that the women nearest the table could follow. Then she moved the winder to the next return. "The pattern repeats at a fixed interval," she said. "That interval allows us to estimate the full woven length before cutting." No one interrupted. Margaret uncovered the first copied entry with 2 spacing cards. The line remained clear. "Widow Shaw, 18 yards accepted." She read the name and figure without haste, then asked the estate steward to confirm the entry against the original ledger. Philip opened the black book without removing his hand from its lower corner. The steward bent over it. "Confirmed," he said. Margaret indicated the retained sample. "The woven repeat suggests the piece was longer than the credited amount." Similar discrepancies appear in 5 other purchases made under the same contract. Reginald smiled faintly. "Suggests. A useful word when certainty is absent." Margaret looked at him. "Certainty belongs to evidence, Mr. Poole. That is why we are here." A murmur passed through the gallery. Philip's aunt lowered her embroidery, but said nothing. Margaret turned to the borough officer. "Will you confirm the standard?" He lifted the official yard, placed it flat upon the table, and measured it against the engraved brass reference he had brought in a locked box. 36 inches, he announced. A lawful yard. Reginald opened his leather case. The brass measure within looked exactly as it had in the morning room. Polished shaft, decorated rosette, and bright ferrule. He withdrew it with his hand at the center, never touching the flower. "I have used this instrument for every purchase challenged today," he said. "Miss Langham believes it alters its length. I invite examination." He placed it beside the borough standard, the ends aligned. The officer checked both edges, then checked them again. 36 inches, he said. A stillness fell that was heavier than surprise. Margaret felt the blood withdraw from her hands. She had expected the measure to appear correct at first. She had told herself so, yet seeing the perfect alignment before so many witnesses made every argument behind it seem suddenly fragile. Gertrude's fan opened with a soft snap. Reginald stepped back from the table. "Perhaps we may now distinguish between suspicion and fact." Margaret reached toward the brass rule. "The rosette must be examined, by all means." Reginald's courtesy was flawless. She placed her thumb where the metal flower met the shaft and pressed. Nothing moved. She changed the angle, remembering the brass worker's demonstration. The rosette remained fixed. She tried the narrow collar beneath the ferrule. It would not turn. "Take your time," Gertrude said from her chair. The words were sweet enough to draw a few smiles. Margaret heard the old dinner room in them. "Take your time, dear. Everyone is waiting." She pressed again. The measure did not change. A merchant coughed into his hand. One of the patronesses whispered behind her glove. Gertrude leaned toward the woman beside her and spoke loudly enough to carry. "She cannot read a notice, and now she cannot measure a yard." The laughter was not broad. That made it worse. It came in restrained breaths, in lowered faces, in the social mercy of people who wished to enjoy humiliation without appearing cruel. Margaret's fingers began to tremble. She withdrew them from the rosette and placed both hands flat on the table. "The instrument may be locked," she said. Reginald raised his brows. "Or it may simply be honest. Mr. Mercer described a dual-position ferrule." A craftsman describing a model does not prove that this is the same device. He marked his repair beneath the sleeve. Then show us the mark. Margaret looked at the fixed ferrule. It could not be drawn out without releasing the hidden catch. The proof lay beneath metal she could not move. Philip stepped forward. That is enough. Margaret turned sharply. His face was controlled, but she recognized the fear beneath it. Not fear that she had lied. Fear that the room would destroy her before the evidence could recover. No, she said, it is not. Philip faced the guests. Miss Langham acts with my full authority in this inquiry. Her conclusions have my confidence, and any insult directed toward her will be regarded as an insult to House Kingsley. The gallery fell silent at once. It was exactly the kind of silence rank could command. Margaret felt something inside her break cleanly. The whispers had stopped, but the truth had not strengthened. It had merely been taken from her hands and placed beneath his title. A county lady near the windows exchanged a knowing glance with another. Reginald's mouth curved. The story had already changed. Margaret was no longer a woman presenting evidence. She was a woman favored by a duke who had made her accusation his cause. Your Grace, she said, you promised not to do this. Philip looked at her. I will not allow them to humiliate you. Then do not speak over me. Margaret, the measure has been manipulated to conceal what you discovered. We do not yet know that. I know you are right. That is not proof. He lowered his voice, but the room remained quiet enough to hear. You should not have to stand alone while they mock you. I asked you to stand beside me, not to make your belief the evidence. His expression changed. He understood then, but understanding came after the harm. Margaret removed her spacing cards from the ledger page. Philip's hand still rested on the book, as it had throughout. She turned the open ledger toward him and closed the brass clasp. The small metallic click crossed the gallery. Truth does not become stronger because a duke claims it, she said. Gertrude watched with undisguised satisfaction. Reginald folded his arms. Philip reached toward Margaret, then stopped before touching her. Do not leave while this is unresolved. It became unresolved the moment you made my judgment dependent upon your favor. That was not my intention. No, it was your decision. She gathered the thread winder and copied slips. Her fingers still shook, but her voice no longer did. I will not exchange my stepmother's definition for yours, Your Grace. Philip went still. Margaret turned to the weaving women. The spring contracts must not be renewed until the measure is independently examined. Philip answered at once. They will not be renewed. She inclined her head, accepting the protection without accepting the man who had offered it wrongly. Then she left the long gallery with her maid and Philip's widowed aunt walking beside her. She refused the ducal carriage waiting beneath the portico. A hired carriage had already arrived from Halifax. With her widowed cousin's elderly companion, who had come at Margaret's request the previous evening, in case the demonstration failed. As the servant secured her small traveling trunk, Philip came down the steps. Margaret. She turned, but did not move toward him. I believed I was protecting you, he said. I know. That was the deepest wound. She entered the carriage. Just before the door closed, Widow Shaw approached under the pretense of adjusting the folded rug across Margaret's knees. Her voice was barely a breath. The flower only shifts when his thumb presses low on the left, miss. Then he turns the collar toward himself. Margaret looked toward Reginald, who stood beneath the portico with the leather case in his hand. His thumb rested exactly where Widow Shaw had described. The carriage pulled away from Dunroyd, carrying Margaret toward Halifax, and, leaving Philip beneath the stone arch, with the promise he had broken still visible in his face, Margaret reached Halifax before dusk on the 17th of May, after little more than an hour on the road from Dunroyd. Yet the distance felt greater than the miles. Her widowed cousin received her in a narrow stone house, overlooking a steep street where carts rattled toward the market, and mill bells marked the hours with practical indifference. No one there asked her to explain herself before she had removed her bonnet. No one told her she had been brave. Her cousin simply ordered tea, gave Margaret the front bedchamber, and instructed the maid to place her small trunk beside the walnut press. That ordinary kindness nearly undid her. By the next morning, newspapers had not yet carried the story, but private letters had travelled faster. A cream envelope bearing the Kingsley seal arrived before breakfast. Inside lay a public statement prepared in Philip's name. It declared that Miss Langham retained the Duke of Tillingham's complete confidence, that her conclusions had been reached with integrity, and that any suggestion of incompetence was false. The words were generous. They were also another version of the same mistake. Margaret read them with a spacing card beneath each line, then folded the statement and returned it unsigned. Her reply contained one sentence. "Your Grace, I won't accept a defense that makes your confidence the measure of my truth." She sent it through her cousin's servant and spent the rest of the morning reconstructing the brass mechanism from memory. Her cousin found an old carpenter's folding rule in a household drawer. Margaret tied a length of thread along one section, then added a wooden sleeve cut by a joiner from the next street. It was crude, but it allowed her to demonstrate how a fixed-looking measure might extend when pressure released a hidden catch. She marked the point Widow Shaw had described, low on the left side near the imaginary rosette. By noon on the 18th, Margaret had arranged to meet 3 weaving women beneath the colonnade of Halifax Peace Hall. Her cousin accompanied her, as did Margaret's maid. The open square within the great stone building echoed with merchants' voices, boots on flagstones, and the movement of folded cloth from one arcade to another. It was public enough for propriety, and busy enough to prevent their gathering from becoming spectacle. Widow Shaw arrived first. Mrs. Bell came next. The third woman, who still refused the use of her name, wore a brown shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. Margaret did not ask her to remove it or sit closer. She placed the wooden mock-up upon a bench between them. "I need each of you to show me what Mr. Poole did," she said. "Not what another woman told you, only what you saw." Widow Shaw pressed her thumb low against the marked point and turned the wooden sleeve toward herself. "Like this." Mrs. Bell repeated the movement without watching her. "He held it longer," she said. His thumb covered the flower until the clerk called the next yard. The third woman remained silent, then took the model and pressed in the same place. Her hand trembled. "He told me I'd forgotten my own weaving," she said. "I hadn't." Margaret let the silence remain. "No," she said at last, "you hadn't." She asked them to repeat the motion separately, and each did. The angle varied little. The thumb went low on the left. The collar turned inward. The sleeve extended. 3 independent memories had met at the same point. That did not yet prove the actual brass rule contained the mechanism, but it established how the women had seen it used. Margaret wrote their statements in spacious lines, leaving wide margins. Before recording any name, she asked permission. 2 agreed. The third chose to be identified only by her loom house number. "That choice will be honored," Margaret said. "Even if the Duke asks," the woman replied. "Especially then." The answer travelled through the small group. Widow Shaw looked at Margaret with new steadiness. "What happens now? We ask for a public examination under the borough's standard, not under House Kingsley authority. And if His Grace objects, then he will object in writing." Margaret carried the mock-up and the 3 statements to the borough office that afternoon. The inspector, a spare man with iron-grey hair and a habit of reading every line twice, examined the model without amusement. He asked whether Margaret had seen the brass ferrule extend herself. "No," she said. "I felt movement beneath the rosette, but I did not see the length change." "Then you have suspicion and witness description, not proof." "Yes." He looked at her more closely, as though expecting disappointment. "Most people who bring me a grievance prefer certainty. Certainty before proof is how this began." The inspector set the wooden model beside his official rule. The instrument used under contract may be required for comparison if notice is properly served. The owner may protest. Let him. A public examination would need a lawful commercial purpose. Margaret had prepared for that. She placed copies of the under-credit calculations before him, each line isolated by space. The spring contracts remain suspended. The workers' wages and future orders depend upon whether the purchasing measure was honest. The inspector read the figures. Saturday market day would provide witnesses. "Saturday, the 4th of June, Margaret said. "If the instrument enters your custody before then." He nodded slowly. "That would be my condition as well." By the 19th, Margaret had drafted 6 conditions of her own. She wrote them without flourish, one to a page, so no clause could be blurred by the next. No prepared speech would be issued in her name. Ducal rank would not be offered as proof. The actual brass measure must enter the borough inspector's custody before the examination. Workers must be permitted to speak directly. Philip must publicly acknowledge that he had approved Reginald's contract without independent standards inspection. Margaret must retain the right to stop the proceedings at any moment. Her cousin read the pages in silence. "You are asking a duke to confess negligence before merchants." "I am asking him to tell the truth." "And if he refuses?" Margaret looked at the cracked thread window beside the wooden mock-up. "Then I proceed without his protection." She sent the conditions to Dunroyd by solicitor's messenger. Philip's answer arrived the following afternoon. He had signed every page. He had altered nothing. Beneath the final condition, he had written, "Miss Langham's right to stop the examination shall be absolute." There was no personal letter attached. Margaret understood the discipline in that absence. He was not using apology to hurry her toward forgiveness. He was obeying. It was the first proof he had offered that did not require her belief. On the 21st of May, the Duke's solicitor came to Halifax and requested a meeting at his office. Philip was not present. The solicitor carried copies of the suspended contracts, the estate, notice protecting the workers, and a formal demand requiring Reginald to produce every measuring instrument used under the spring agreements. Margaret reviewed the demand with her spacing cards. "Where will the inspection occur?" she asked. "At Dunroyd, unless you prefer the borough office." The borough office. His Grace expected that answer. She ignored the warmth that moved through her. "I will not return to Dunroyd before the instrument is secured." His Grace asked whether you would meet him here when the time comes. "At this office," Margaret said, "with my cousin present." The solicitor inclined his head. "I shall convey it exactly." That evening, The formal notice reached Reginald Poole. His reply came before nightfall. It was brief, courteous, and designed to end the matter. The brass measure, he claimed, had gone missing during carriage transport after the failed demonstration. Margaret read the sentence twice. Then she placed it beside the 3 witness statements and the wooden mock-up. A man who possessed an honest tool had no reason to lose it, only after someone learned how it lied. On the 22nd of May, Philip came to Halifax at the proper hour for a morning call announced by his card and received in the drawing room of Margaret's widowed cousin. He arrived without flowers, jewels, or any object that might turn apology into courtship before she had granted him the right. Margaret's cousin sat near the window with a basket of mending. Margaret's maid remained within sight beside the open door. Philip stood until Margaret indicated the chair opposite hers. And even then, he did not reach for the careful charm that had carried him through hostile committees and crowded dinners. "I won't ask you to return to Dunroyd," he said. "I won't ask you to forgive me today. I came to name what I did." Margaret rested one spacing card beneath the letter from Reginald, claiming the brass measure had been lost. She had been reading it when Philip arrived. Then name it. He accepted the severity without flinching. "I announced that you would demonstrate your method before I asked whether you consented. I turned your discovery into proof that I was not my father. After promising that rank would not replace evidence, I used my title to silence the room. I spoke when you had told me not to speak for you." The precision of the words made them harder to dismiss. He had not called his actions confusion or excessive concern. He had not hidden them beneath love, fear, or good intentions. "You believed you were protecting me," Margaret said. "I did. Do you still believe that?" Philip looked down at his gloves, which lay folded across one knee. "I believe I stopped their laughter. I also believe I made every person in that gallery wonder whether your conclusions existed. Because I favored you, I replaced one insult with another story about who you were, and both stories were written without your permission." Her cousin's needle moved steadily through linen. No one rescued him from the silence. Margaret asked, "If the truth makes House Kingsley appear negligent, will you still allow it to be published?" "Yes, if the workers say your contract system enabled Reginald, yes. If the county learns you approved him without independent standards inspection, they will learn it from me." He took a folded document from his coat, but did not offer it directly to Margaret. He placed it on the table between them. "This is my signed admission for the solicitor. It states that I approved Mr. Poole's contract, that the estate relied upon his private measure, and that I did not require comparison against the borough standard before payment entries were accepted." Margaret drew the paper closer. The handwriting was broad and clear. Whether by chance or intention, each line had been given room. She read it slowly, using the card beneath the words. Philip waited without watching her mouth. When she finished, she placed the statement beside Reginald's reply. "This will cost you." "It should. That is not the same as repairing what happened between us." "I know." The quiet answer reached her more deeply than a declaration would have done. Philip had always known how to act. He was only beginning to understand how to wait. Margaret touched the edge of his signed admission. "Lady Langham has begun telling people that I invented the accusation to gain influence over you." Philip's mouth hardened. "I heard the rumor before leaving Dunroyd." "What did you say?" "Nothing about my feelings for you." Margaret looked up. "Nothing." "My secretary prepared a statement suggesting that my confidence in you was founded upon long acquaintance and personal regard. I destroyed it. Why? Because it would have answered one claim by placing you beneath another. It would have implied that your access to the investigation came from my affection. His gaze held hers. Your choices are not evidence of my possession. Something unsteady moved beneath Margaret's ribs. He had defended her publicly at Dunroyd because he could not bear to let the room wound her. Now he was allowing society to speculate rather than bind her name to his protection. Restraint cost him more than command. That was why she believed it. This is the first protection you have offered me that leaves me entirely free, she said. Emotion crossed his face before discipline concealed it. Then I shall try to deserve the sentence. He did not reach for her hand. He did not ask whether freedom might eventually lead her back to him. He turned instead to Reginald's letter. The measure was not lost during carriage transport. You are certain? Not yet in a form a magistrate would accept. But the estate coachman, who supposedly carried the case, says Mr. Poole made no journey after the demonstration. Could another carriage have been used? That is possible. The contract inventory should tell us where the instrument was last recorded. Philip rose only when Margaret's cousin rang for fresh tea, and he left before the call could become improper in length. At the door, he paused. May I send the inventory findings through the solicitor? Yes. And may I call again if they concern the examination? Margaret considered him. For that purpose. He bowed. For that purpose. By the following afternoon, the inquiry had moved from rumour to records. The estate coachman came to Halifax with the steward and gave his account in the solicitor's office, where Margaret sat with her cousin nearby. Philip remained at Dunroyd, so no one could say the witness had been shaped beneath ducal scrutiny. The coachman was a heavy-set man named Mr. Dobbins, uncomfortable in a room filled with legal paper. He held his hat between both hands. Mr. Poole says the brass rule disappeared during carriage transport on the evening after the Long Gallery inspection, the solicitor said. Did you drive him that day? No, sir. Did any Dunroyd carriage carry him, his leather case, or business instruments from the house? Not one under my charge. Could a stable hand have taken a smaller vehicle, Mr. Dobbins shook his head. Every horse was entered. His bay remained in the lower stable until the next morning. No gig went out after 4. Margaret asked, Where did Mr. Poole go when the guests left? The coachman glanced toward the steward. The dye house, miss. I saw him cross the lower yard with the leather case. Did he leave again? Not by the main road. The solicitor recorded the answer without drawing a conclusion. After the coachman departed, the steward opened the spring contract inventory. Each instrument used in purchase had been listed when the contracts began. The brass yard measure appeared beside Reginald's name, along with the words stored, when not in use, in the locked measuring drawer, Dunroyd Dye House. A later notation confirmed that the instrument had been returned there after the public demonstration. The entry bore the initials of the dye house clerk and the date, 17th of May. Margaret read the line twice. Who holds the drawer key? Mr. Poole, the steward said. A duplicate is sealed in the estate office, but the drawer has not been opened since the inspection. Then, the measure's last verified location is still Dunroyd. Yes. Philip's solicitor folded Reginald's false reply and placed it beside the inventory. His Grace can order the drawer opened. Margaret looked at the chain of facts. Reginald had claimed a journey no carriage record supported. A witness had seen him take the case to the dye house. The inventory placed the measure in a locked drawer under his control. Suspicion had become enough for a formal inspection, but not enough for secret seizure. "Not by himself," she said. "The borough inspector must be present." "So must Reginald." The solicitor nodded. His Grace anticipated that condition. He produced a formal notice already drafted but unsigned. It required Reginald to attend an inspection of the dye house tools under the estate contract, with the steward, solicitor, borough inspector, and Duke present as witnesses. Margaret reviewed each line with her spacing card. Nothing accused Reginald of fraud. Nothing granted him time to remove the instrument without violating the order. She handed the paper back. "Serve it." At Dunroyd that evening, Philip signed the notice beneath the Kingsley seal. Reginald received it in the drawing room while Gertrude stood beside the fire. His eyes moved once across the date of inspection, then toward the lower windows overlooking the dye house yard. The measure he had declared lost remained behind a locked drawer whose key still rested in his own pocket. The key turned once, caught, and refused to move. Reginald Poole stood before the locked, measuring drawer in the Dunroyd dye house on the morning of the 25th of May, his gloved hand resting upon the brass key, as though the stubborn lock were a personal insult. The room smelled of wet wool, mordant, and old timber. Pale light entered through high windows, stained by years of steam. Philip stood beside the borough inspector, with the estate, solicitor, and steward positioned near the inventory table. No servant had been allowed to clear, shift, or open anything before the witnesses arrived. The drawer appeared exactly where the spring contract inventory placed it, beneath a long counter used for measuring cloth. Reginald tried the key again. "It hasn't been opened since the demonstration," he said. "The damp may have swollen the wood." "The inventory records the drawer as opened on the 17th, the solicitor replied. "The dye house clerk entered the instrument after the gathering." Reginald looked at him. "Then the clerk may have damaged the lock." Philip did not answer the excuse. "Turn the key toward the window, Mr. Poole." Reginald's fingers tightened. He obeyed. The lock yielded with a dry metallic click. The borough inspector stepped forward before the drawer could be pulled open. He examined the keyhole, the seal on the duplicate inventory, and the edges of the wood. "No visible breakage," he said. "No sign of forced entry." Reginald withdrew the drawer. Inside lay 3 wooden rules, a coil of marking cord, 2 chalk holders, and an object wrapped in oiled cloth. No one touched it at first. The inspector read each item aloud while the steward checked the inventory. When he reached the wrapped object, Reginald's composure changed so slightly that only Philip appeared to notice. His shoulders remained straight. His breathing did not. "What is that?" the inspector asked. "An old measure," Reginald said. "Not the one in dispute. You stated that the disputed measure was lost during carriage transport." "It was. Then this should present no difficulty." The inspector lifted the bundle with both hands and placed it on the cleared counter. He unfolded the oiled cloth without pressing the rosette or touching the ferrule. The polished brass yard measure appeared beneath it. The decorative flower caught the grey morning light. Philip felt the memory of Margaret's fingers upon that same metal, followed by Reginald's swift attempt to take it from her. "That resembles the instrument used in the long gallery," the steward said. Reginald gave a small shrug. "Many brass measures resemble one another." "Does this one belong to you?" the solicitor asked. "I cannot say without examining it." "You will not examine it." The borough inspector's tone carried no ducal force, only official procedure. He checked the shaft for engraved initials and found R.P. near the lower edge. He then compared the case number recorded in the inventory with a small stamped number beside the hinge of the leather case found at the back of the same drawer. They matched. The instrument remains unopened. He said, its present visible length and mechanism will not be tested here. Reginald's gaze moved toward Philip. Why not? Surely His Grace wants the matter ended. Philip met his eyes. I want it examined where no one can claim that House Kingsley altered the result. The inspector wrapped the measure again, placed it inside a padded evidence case, and closed the lid. He threaded sealing cord through the clasps and pressed the borough seal into dark red wax. The solicitor and steward signed the custody receipt. Reginald was asked to sign that the instrument had been found in his locked drawer. I sign only to its location, he said, not to ownership or use. The limitation will be recorded, the solicitor replied. Reginald signed. The inspector gave one receipt to him, one to Philip, and retained the original. The case will remain in the borough office until the public examination, he said. No person, including His Grace, will have private access. Philip inclined his head, as Miss Langham required. Reginald looked toward him sharply. Philip allowed the silence to answer. Before the witnesses left, the steward produced a separate estate file recovered that morning from the correspondence cabinet. It contained a signed instruction in Gertrude Langham's hand directing that Widow Shaw be removed from the winter coal list after making what Gertrude called an insolent complaint regarding measurement. The date preceded Philip's protective order by 1 day. Reginald read the first line and looked away. My mother advises the household charities, he said. She was entitled to review recipients. She was not entitled to punish a contract witness, Philip answered. The solicitor placed the document in a separate packet and sealed it for examination. That afternoon, the co-trustee responsible for Margaret's allowance received copies of the worker statements and Gertrude's signed instruction. By the 27th of May, he issued temporary notice, freezing Gertrude's authority to approve deductions, delays, or changes to Margaret's payments until the trust could be formally reviewed. Philip did not order the action. He supplied evidence and allowed the trustee to act within his own authority. On the 28th, Margaret sat in the Halifax solicitor's office, with her widowed cousin beside her and her maid near the open door. The exact evidence inventory lay before her in spacious lines: the brass measure, the matching leather case, the drawer location, the stamped initials, the custody seal, the signed receipt, and Gertrude's coal list instruction. The black calfskin ledger remained with Philip and had never left supervised custody. Margaret read every entry using one narrow card beneath the line. Philip sat across from her. He had travelled from Dunroyd that morning, but had not entered the room until her cousin was present. The inspector has not opened the ferrule, he said. No one has tested the rosette since the case was sealed. Good. Margaret moved the card to the next line, Mr. Mercer must identify his repair mark only at the public examination. He has agreed to attend. Has he been told the instrument was found? Only that a sealed measure will be presented. He has not been shown it. Margaret finished reading the inventory and placed the card aside. Then the chain is clean. Philip watched her, but he did not allow relief to become triumph. Do you still wish to proceed at the Peace Hall? Yes, even now that the measure has been recovered. Especially now. She touched the document without taking possession of it. but I will not stand there to prove that I can read as other people demand. What will you do? I will show the cloth. The workers will describe what they saw. The inspector will examine the mechanism. The ledger will confirm the loss. And the written entries. I may read one. I may ask the steward to read the rest. That choice remains mine. Philip nodded. You will decide the order of every item, including your admission, including mine. You will not speak before I ask you. I will not. Margaret studied him. The man before her possessed enough authority to control every room they had entered together. Yet he had allowed an inspector to seal the evidence, a trustee to act independently, and a woman he loved but had not claimed to determine when his own fault would be spoken. You understand that I may stop even after the case is opened, she said. Yes, even if stopping harms your reputation. Yes, even if you believe continuing would vindicate me. His answer came without hesitation. Yes. The room became very quiet. Philip rose, but did not approach her. There is one thing I would ask that has nothing to do with the examination. Margaret's pulse shifted. What is it? He held her gaze. May I embrace you? No urgency entered his voice. No expectation disguised itself as tenderness. He waited with his hands at his sides, leaving the space between them entirely hers. Margaret stood. For a moment, she remembered the long gallery, the laughter, and the instant when his protection had closed around her like another definition. Then she looked at the inventory, the signed limits, and the evidence he had refused to control. She crossed the distance herself. Philip's arms came around her carefully. He held her without drawing her closer than she chose. Margaret placed her hands against his coat and allowed her forehead to rest beneath his chin. The embrace contained no victory. It held apology, caution, and a trust that had not returned whole but had begun to return honestly. When she stepped back, he released her at once. He did not ask for a kiss. Margaret looked toward the sealed inventory and then back at him. At Halifax, she said, the truth will be measured before anyone speaks for it. Philip inclined his head, and you will choose who speaks first. By the 29th of May, the drawing room in Margaret's cousin's Halifax house had become a chamber of preparation rather than refuge. The evidence itself remained where it belonged. The brass measure was sealed in the borough office. The official yard standard remained in municipal custody. Philip's black calfskin ledger stayed under his or the solicitor's supervision. Gertrude's signed coal list instruction lay in a sealed legal packet. Margaret possessed only copies, her spacing cards, her cracked yew-wood thread winder, and the wooden model she had made to explain the hidden ferrule. That was enough. She arranged 8 cards across the table, each bearing one stage of the public examination in broad handwriting. The official yard standard would come first, then the sealed brass rule, then the ferrule mechanism. After that, worker observation, cloth pattern, ledger entry, Gertrude's instruction, and Philip's admission. Nothing would be introduced merely for drama. Nothing would be withheld to create surprise. Every fact would arrive only after the one, before it had prepared the room to understand. Philip sat opposite her, with the estate solicitor at one side and Margaret's widowed cousin near the windows. Her maid remained by the open door. The Duke had arrived from Dunroyd after the morning post, carrying no personal gift and making no attempt to turn the planning meeting into reconciliation. The newspapers have asked for places inside the Peace Hall before the examination begins. The solicitor said, 2 Leeds correspondents and 1 man from York. Margaret moved the spacing card beneath the request. They may enter after the evidence is complete. The solicitor hesitated. They will accuse us of managing the account. Then they may accuse us afterward. Philip did not argue. Miss Langham's condition stands. Margaret looked toward him. You agree? Yes, even though delayed reporting may appear like suppression. It would be suppression if I chose it to control the story. It is restraint because you choose it to protect the evidence. His answer held no defensiveness. Margaret turned to the witness list. Widow Shaw and Mrs. Bell had agreed to speak under their own names. The third woman had not. Beside Loom House's 11, Margaret had written only the number and the words identity withheld by choice. No one will press her to remove the number, Margaret said. Not the magistrates, not the merchants, and not His Grace. Philip inclined his head, agreed. The solicitor cleared his throat. There may be difficulty if Mr. Poole claims he cannot answer an unnamed accuser. She is not the sole witness, Margaret replied. Her statement confirms a motion already described by 2 named women. The mechanism will be examined independently. Her privacy does not create the proof. Quite right, Philip said. Margaret continued. The workers will speak before the ledger is opened. The solicitor frowned. Would it not be stronger to begin with written records? No, if the book comes first. Society will believe the Duke discovered a clerical error and kindly allowed women to confirm it. The women saw the method. The book records its result. Their knowledge must not be made secondary to his property. Philip's hand rested beside his signed admission. Then they speak first. The simplicity of his obedience disturbed her in a way resistance might not have done. He had once moved too quickly because he feared delay. Now he allowed each instruction to settle before he accepted the next. Margaret looked at his statement. It acknowledged that he had approved Reginald's contract without requiring comparison against the borough standard. You will read this yourself, she said. Yes. You will not add an explanation about your father. No. You will not say you acted in good faith. I did act in good faith. His tone remained quiet. But I understand that good faith does not restore wages. I will not offer it as a defense. Margaret studied him. And if Gertrude attacks me while you are speaking, I will wait until you decide whether the attack requires an answer. Even if she calls me a liar, yes, even if she says I have influenced you, a shadow crossed his face. Yes, the solicitor looked down at his papers. Philip's discipline did not make the question painless. It made the pain visible. That afternoon, confirmation arrived that Gertrude intended to attend. Her note to the borough inspector claimed a duty to protect the reputation of her late husband's daughter from what she called improper political influence. She requested permission to present private family observations regarding Margaret's reading ability and emotional judgment. Margaret read the note, with a spacing card beneath each line. The old fear returned with physical precision. Her throat tightened. Her breath shortened. The letters remained clear enough, but the space around them seemed to shrink. Philip noticed. He did not reach across the table. "Do you want her excluded?" he asked. Margaret set down the letter. "Can she be lawfully excluded? The Peace Hall examination is not a family gathering. The inspector may remove anyone who disrupts it." "That is not what I asked," Philip considered. "No, not merely because her presence distresses you." "Then she attends." "Margaret, if she is excluded by your request, she will say I required silence to protect my influence over you. Let her speak when the inspector permits it. Let everyone hear exactly what she believes proves a woman unfit to judge measurement." Philip's expression hardened, but he nodded. You control the order, not her words. No, only my answer. Yes. The others withdrew before tea, leaving Margaret's cousin in the adjoining salon and the maid within sight of the open door. Philip remained, because Margaret had asked him to review the final sequence once more. By the 1st of June, every witness had confirmed attendance. Mr. Mercer would identify his 3-leaf repair punch only after the inspector opened the ferrule. Widow Shaw would demonstrate where Reginald placed his thumb. Mrs. Bell would describe the turn of the collar. The cloth sample would be measured last among the physical objects, so no one could claim. Margaret had forced the mechanism to match a theory. Philip read the order in silence. It is better than anything I would have arranged, he said. Because it is accurate, because it does not place me at the center. Margaret looked at him. The late afternoon light had softened the severity of his face, though weariness remained beneath his eyes. You once said you feared becoming your father. I still do. Then why does this feel different? He stood near the hearth, hands held loosely behind him. Because I have understood something I did not wish to see. Margaret waited. Philip looked toward the evidence cards, then back to her. I wanted to be known as a reforming duke. I wanted Parliament, the county, and perhaps myself to believe I had repaired what my father neglected. When you discovered the discrepancy, I saw justice. I also saw proof that I was the man I wanted to be. His voice lowered. I did not ask what it would cost you to become that proof. Margaret felt the truth of the admission settle between them. You were not wrong to want reform. No, I was wrong to make your courage serve my need to appear honorable. I do not require you to become powerless, Philip. It was the first time she had used his Christian name. He went very still. What do you require? That power listened before it decides what truth should look like. His breath changed. Not much. Enough. I am trying. I know. He took one step nearer, then stopped. There is something else I must say before Saturday, because saying it afterward might look like a reward for success. Margaret's pulse began to beat harder. Say it. I love you. He did not soften the words with qualifiers. I love your precision. I love that you refuse comfort when comfort requires falsehood. I love the way you leave room for people who have been crowded out. I loved you before I understood how badly I had failed you, and I will love you if you stop the examination before the first seal is opened. Margaret held his gaze. The room seemed quieter than it had during the embrace in the solicitor's office. You are not asking for an answer? No, not before Saturday. Not after Saturday, unless you choose to give one. He came no closer. May I kiss you? Margaret felt fear, affection, and the memory of his restraint meet in the same breath. She did not wait for him to cross the distance. She stepped forward herself. Yes. Philip lifted one hand slowly, giving her time to refuse before his fingers touched the side of her face. The kiss was gentle at first, almost uncertain, though nothing else about him had ever seemed uncertain. Margaret placed one hand against his coat and closed the remaining space. He followed her choice, not his own urgency. The kiss deepened only enough to carry promise, never possession. When they parted, his forehead rested lightly against hers. I love you, he said again. Margaret's eyes burned, but she did not answer with words. She was not yet ready to place outside consequence. My answer will come after we have both stood in the room where truth costs us something. Philip drew back at once. Then I will wait. On the 3rd of June, the final notices were sealed. Gertrude's attendance was confirmed. Reginald's solicitor announced that his client would challenge every witness. The brass measure remained unopened in the borough office. Before dawn the next morning, bells began calling merchants through the streets of Halifax toward the Peace Hall. By 9 o'clock on Saturday, the 4th of June, Halifax Peace Hall had become a chamber of judgment without ever pretending to be a court. Merchants stood beneath the stone arcades beside folded cloth and account satchels. Women outworkers gathered near the front by their own request. 2 local magistrates, the borough inspector, the estate solicitor, Philip Steward, and several county witnesses occupied a long table set beneath the central gallery. The newspapers had not been admitted. They waited outside with everyone else, who had been told that evidence would come before reputation. Margaret entered with her widowed cousin and maid. She carried no speech. Her cracked yew-wood threadwinder rested in her reticule, and her spacing cards lay inside a plain folder. Philip stood at the far end of the evidence table with the black calfskin ledger beneath his hand. He did not come toward her. He waited until she chose her place. Gertrude sat among the county ladies in severe lavender silk. Reginald stood beside his solicitor, composed enough to suggest that the sealed instrument could only vindicate him. The borough inspector called the gathering to order. "This is an examination of a measuring instrument used under contract," he said. "It is not a criminal trial. Statements and objects found relevant will be referred to the proper magistrates." Margaret placed her 8 evidence cards before her. "Begin with the standard," she said. The inspector opened the locked municipal box and withdrew the official yard. He laid it against the certified brass reference. 36 inches. The sealed evidence case came next. The dark red wax remained unbroken. The inspector showed the signatures on the custody cord, then cut it before the magistrates. He removed the oiled cloth and lifted Reginald's brass measure by the center. The decorative rosette near the ferrule caught the light. He placed it beside the official standard, the ends aligned. 36 inches, he announced. Reginald allowed himself a breath of satisfaction. Gertrude turned slightly toward the women behind her. "We have traveled a long way to discover that a yard remains a yard." Margaret heard the old cruelty in the softness of her voice. Her throat tightened. The letters on her first card seemed to press closer, but she did not look down. "Mrs. Shaw," she said, "will you show the inspector where Mr. Poole placed his thumb?" Alice Shaw came forward. Her hands were rough from work, but they did not tremble. She touched the lower left edge of the brass flower. "Here," Mrs. Bell confirmed the same point. The third woman remained identified only as Loom House 11. Her choice honored. Her written statement was read by the solicitor without revealing her name. The inspector pressed where the women had indicated. Nothing moved. Reginald's solicitor smiled. Margaret continued, "Turn the collar toward yourself." The inspector did. At first, the metal resisted. Then a small internal catch released with a quiet click. The ferrule slid outward. A murmur rolled beneath the arches. The inspector placed the measure beside the standard again. The brass rule extended beyond it. He checked the difference twice, 37 1/4 inches. Reginald's composure broke at last. That mechanism could have been altered after seizure. "The instrument remained under borough seal," the inspector replied. "The seal was intact." Mr. Elias Mercer, the brass worker, stepped forward. He did not touch the rule until invited. When the ferrule was fully extended, he turned the lower sleeve and pointed beneath it. 3 small leaves had been stamped into the metal. "That is my repair punch," he said. I fitted the dual-position ferrule at Mr. Poole's request before Christmas. Retracted, it measures 36 inches. Extended, 37 1/4. Did you know how it would be used? A magistrate asked. No, sir. Reginald lifted his chin. A mechanism is not proof that I used it dishonestly. Margaret placed her thread winder upon the retained grey cloth. No, the cloth shows the use. She counted the woven repeat aloud. 12 narrow ribs, 1 broad rib. The pattern returned with patient certainty across the sample. Widow Shaw then described how she had counted 19 yards before delivery. The steward confirmed that the retained cloth had been taken before finishing, so shrinkage could not explain the loss. Margaret asked Philip to open the ledger. He did so without speaking. She placed a spacing card above the relevant line and another below it. The handwriting remained visible in a single clear strip. Her breath shortened. Gertrude watched with the satisfaction of someone expecting an old failure to repeat. Margaret rested one finger beside the entry and read slowly. Widow Shaw. 18 yards accepted. She paused. No one completed the line for her. No one hurried her. The pause belonged to her, she continued. Payment entered for 18 yards. The steward produced 5 additional entries. Their underpayments increased with the length of each piece. The pattern was no longer a suspicion. It was a system. The inspector demonstrated the arithmetic. A longer false yard reduced the number of yards credited to every worker, while the buyer retained the difference in cloth and value. Gertrude rose. This entire spectacle depends upon Margaret's interpretation. She has never possessed the ability to read complex accounts with consistency. Margaret looked at her, the piece hall blurred at its edges, but Gertrude's face remained clear. I have always read slowly, Lady Langham. You mistook haste for truth. Gertrude's expression hardened. You have been led into this by a man whose interest in you is hardly impartial. Philip did not move. He did not speak. Margaret felt the cost of his silence and the respect within it. His Grace's feelings do not change the length of brass, she said. The estate steward then presented Gertrude's signed instruction removing Widow Shaw from the winter coal list after her complaint. Gertrude tried to call it charitable discretion. The date, wording, and timing exposed it as coercion. The co-trustee confirmed that her access to Margaret's allowance had already been suspended pending formal proceedings. Philip lifted his own signed statement. I approved Mr. Poole's contract without requiring independent comparison against the borough standard, he said. I relied upon reputation where I should have required proof. House Kingsley enabled this fraud by failing to inspect the instrument used in its name. He did not mention his father. He did not offer intention as defense. Reginald's solicitor objected that no criminal intent had been proved. One magistrate answered that the hidden mechanism, the false claim that the instrument had been lost, the locked drawer, recovery, the repeated wage pattern, and the witness statements justified formal examination. The brass rule, ledger extracts, statements, and sealed correspondence would be delivered into legal custody. Reginald's contract was terminated at once. His commercial bond was frozen pending worker claims. The county committee removed Gertrude from her patroness position. Her final removal from Margaret's trust would proceed through chancery, not ducal command. The room did not erupt into applause. Instead, the women nearest the table began saying Margaret's name, not loudly, clearly. Widow Shaw said it first. Mrs. Bell followed, and then the others. Philip waited until the inspector closed the evidence record. Only then did he address the gathering. I owe Miss Langham a public apology. I once turned her into evidence of my own virtue. I trusted her conclusion, but I did not trust her right to choose how that truth should be heard. She corrected me. I stand here because she required that power answer to proof. In the quiet side gallery afterward, Margaret found Philip alone beneath one of the arches. The sounds of the market had begun to return below them. He did not reach for her. You kept your promise, she said. I nearly failed it when Lady Langham spoke. But you did not, because you asked power to listen. Margaret stepped closer. I love you, not because you trusted me first, but because you learned that trust must leave me free. The restraint left his face. I love you, Margaret. He lifted one hand, but waited. She placed her palm against his cheek and kissed him first. His arms came around her only after she leaned into him, and the second kiss held no claim, only recognition. When they parted, Philip kept his forehead near hers. May I begin a proper courtship after the legal examination? He asked. Margaret smiled through the tears she no longer needed to hide. You may call on Monday, Your Grace. On Thursday, the 13th of October, the great square of Halifax Peace Hall held the mellow light of early autumn, and the last movement of a fair measure market just drawing to its close. Merchants folded wool beneath the arcades. Clerks tied their account bundles with red tape. Women, who had once waited outside estate offices, now stood openly beside tables, where every piece was measured against a public 36-inch standard fixed, where buyers and sellers could see it. Margaret, Duchess of Tillingham for 8 days, remained near the central table after the crowd had begun to thin. Marriage had changed her name and her rank. It had not changed the careful pace with which she read a crowded page, nor had anyone who loved her asked it to. A clerk had prepared each wage explanation in broad handwriting with generous space between the lines. When a worker preferred the figures spoken, they were read aloud. When she preferred to read them herself, no one hurried her. Margaret had required both forms before agreeing to serve as patroness and as a member of the examining committee. She did not command the market as though born to office. She listened, compared, and asked the question others had learned to overlook. Philip stood several feet away, speaking with the borough inspector and 2 merchants. He wore no public triumph. The legal consequences had taken months, and none had belonged to him alone. Reginald Poole had been convicted at the summer assizes of fraudulent use of a false measure and obtaining money by false pretenses. The court had imposed a term of penal servitude. His commercial bond and the profits recovered from his accounts now funded most of the restitution owed to the women he had underpaid. Philip had not made them wait for the court. Within days of the Peace Hall examination, he had paid the arrears from his private funds, with every payment entered separately so that repayment by the bond could later be traced, without erasing the original wrong. The brass rule itself remained in legal custody. It had not become a curiosity for visitors, nor a trophy for House Kingsley. It remained evidence. Gertrude Langham had met a quieter consequence. By court order, she had been removed from all control over Margaret's trust. The diverted portions of Margaret's allowance were to be repaid from Gertrude's jointure income. County patronesses who had once welcomed her wit and polished malice no longer received her. She retained the title owed to the widow of Sir Walter Langham, but no longer possessed authority over Margaret's money, residence, correspondence, or future. There had been no repentance. Margaret had not required one in order to be free. The freedom had been secured in writing before the wedding. Her marriage settlement placed her trust under separate trustees and preserved her independent property. Philip had agreed to every protection without calling it distrust. A promise is not weakened by being written plainly. He had said when the solicitor read the final clause, "It's made easier to honor." Their courtship had begun on the Monday after the examination, exactly as Margaret had permitted. Philip called at her cousin's house in Halifax under proper chaperonage. He walked with her beneath the Peace Hall colonnade, when her cousin and maid followed at a discreet distance. He listened when she spoke of work, not only when she spoke of pain. He never announced an engagement before she gave him leave. When he asked her to marry him at the end of August, he offered no ring across a crowded room and no audience for her answer. He opened his hand and waited. Margaret had placed hers in it and said yes, because the choice remained entirely hers. They were married on Wednesday, the 5th of October, in the parish church near Dunroyd. The ceremony was small by ducal standards. Widow Shaw and Mrs. Bell sat among the invited witnesses. Margaret's widowed cousin stood near the front. Philip's aunt wept without apology. Gertrude did not attend. Now, 8 days later, the first fair measure market since their marriage had ended without dispute. At the central table lay a bolt-stamped full measure. Beside it rested Margaret's cracked yew-wood thread-winder, unchanged from the day the insult had first crossed the wool-room at Dunroyd. One spoke remained split. The worn edge still carried the warmth of her palm. Margaret placed it along the cloth and counted the repeat once more. 12 narrow ribs, 1 broad rib. The pattern returned where it should. 19 yards, Widow Shaw said beside her. 19 credited, the clerk confirmed. He turned the page so Margaret could see the entry. The line was broad and clear. Payment in full. Margaret read it without haste. Her throat did not tighten. That was not because the difficulty had vanished. It was because no one in the hall was waiting for her to fail. Widow Shaw touched Margaret's sleeve. "They put your name on the county circular." Margaret smiled. "They put yours there, too. It says we gave evidence. You did. Most gentlemen would have called us grateful witnesses and left themselves at the center." Margaret looked toward Philip. He had finished speaking with the inspector and was approaching, but he stopped before joining them, leaving Widow Shaw the choice to continue. "His Grace is learning," Margaret said. Philip heard the final words. "Slowly," he replied, "but with exceptional instruction." Widow Shaw laughed and took her leave. The clerk carried the corrected accounts toward the borough office. Philip then brought the black calfskin ledger from the supervised committee table. The brass clasp remained polished from use. The original entries had not been erased. Each underpayment stood where it had first been recorded, followed by a separate restoration line and the date on which the worker received the missing wages. Margaret opened to the final fair measure page. Her name appeared beneath the committee notation in her own spacious hand. Margaret Langham Kingsley, Duchess of Tillingham. The title did not crowd the woman who had written it. Philip placed the ledger beside the full measure cloth. "Would you like to close it?" he asked. Margaret looked at the final line. The first time he had placed this ledger before her, he had trusted what she could see. Later, he had nearly ruined that trust by deciding how the world must see her. Now the record contained both failures and repair. "Yes," she said. She closed the book. The clasp met with a soft click. Above the table, the borough's public brass standard caught a band of late sunlight. Below it lay the full yard of cloth, the corrected ledger, and the cracked thread winder that had never needed to become perfect in order to remain useful. The last merchants departed, quiet spread beneath the arches. Philip offered his hand, palm upward, as he had done before the long gallery, and again when he asked her to marry him. Margaret chose to place her hand in his. They walked side by side through the colonnade, while the market servants closed the outer gates. "The arches sound different when the hall is empty," she said. "Different from June. Different from every room where someone was waiting to tell me what I couldn't do." Philip lifted her hand to his lips. "What do they sound like now?" Margaret listened to their footsteps returning from the stone. No laughter followed them. No voice supplied the next word. "They sound as though the silence belongs to me." He turned toward her. "I love you, Margaret. I love you too." He touched his lips to her forehead, then waited until she lifted her face. The kiss that followed was familiar, gentle, and freely returned. When they parted, they remained beneath the public standard with their hands joined, while the last autumn light rested upon the thread winder, the honest cloth, and Margaret's name visible on the closed ledger.